So hi, yeah, I'm Holly Lewis, co-founding partner from We Made That, and I've been asked this evening to talk about a bit about how we started and then some kind of more recent work. So it's a sort of smash together of those two things really. And from what I understand, there might be some students on the call. So if one bit is more interesting than the other, maybe shout or put something in the chat or something, and I'm sure I can elaborate on things as we're going through. This is roughly our team right now. Few slightly different faces, but that's broadly it. So We Made That, this is how we describe ourselves. We Made That is an energetic architecture and urbanism practice with a strong public conscience. And for us, what that means is that nearly all of our clients are public sector, sometimes third sector and charity clients. We don't do any domestic work or any work for private developers. And that is because what we're really interested in is that relationship between what we do and how we're kind of making impact in the general public, or the relationship between architecture and design and the general public, which I think can be a slightly dysfunctional relationship, if that's not too strong to say right up front. And we really appreciate the sort of democratic accountability that comes with having public sector clients. So that's where we sit, and we're really comfortable with that. The work of the practice, as has already been sort of mentioned, broadly splits into these three strands. So urban research, we actually have a research team in-house who are not from a design background, but more kind of socioeconomic. They've got a range of different skills, but they help us to really understand places in a really high level of detail. We find that really useful for design work, but it also is a kind of output in and of itself. And so there are projects in the office that are just research commissions, just with a kind of documented output. But what that allows us to do is kind of become experts in certain things, which we really enjoy. We do quite a lot of area strategies and master plans, and that can be from the scale of just an individual high street. This is an example from Finchley Church End in Barnet, all the way up to much bigger master plans. So I was just talking to Joshua and Sarah at the beginning of this, and we were doing a webinar presentation last night for a master plan for around 9,000 homes on the Purley Way in Croydon. So it can be across quite a wide range of scales. And then delivery of architecture in public realm. We are not that hung up on whether it's a building or whether it's a public space, but we do like delivering stuff. Other people seem to be much more interested about whether it has walls and roofs than I ever have been. But we do like to have some delivery projects in the office, and as long as those are kind of for the public benefit, then we're really happy to take those on. Across all of those strands, though, there are some recurring themes that appear in research strategies and delivery for us. So we've done a lot of work relating to high streets. That started, years ago, 2012. And continues to be a theme for us to the point where I'm on the government's High Street Task Force, for example, and we've done something like work on 34 of London's high streets, and increasingly we're being commissioned to undertake town centre strategies and things like that in places outside of London because of that sort of high street expertise. So that's really interesting for us. Places of work also comes up a lot, particularly industrial places. And this is Charlton Riverside in London, where we did an audit. That relationship between industry and housing, which is quite starkly shown, I think, in this image, is something that we've also looked into a lot and comes up a lot in the portfolio. And culture is also something that we're really interested in. I guess across all of these things, housing doesn't feature. And whilst it's a component of the master planning work that we do, I guess what really drives us is understanding all those things that make cities exciting places to be. There's plenty of people that can do housing, and we sort of choose not to do that. So I mentioned at the presentation I was going to kind of talk about how we started. So I was trying to graph it, and basically this is, we number all of our projects. We're on number 227 or something like that at the moment, and started in 2006. And I did a little talk a while ago kind of thinking about how the office started, and I think the point is that this was a really long period from starting doing some projects, a project in 2006 to, we went full-time, or like both quit our jobs 2010, which on this graph looks terrifying. but it was a really long period to get the office going. And I think this, we get a lot of questions about working in the public sector and how we've built up this portfolio that sustains around 20 people these days. But for us, it was that kind of long incubation period, which is not a helpful thing for anybody who's wanting to get into this sector or start up a practice that might be interested in similar things. But for us, that is how it happened. So I'm just going to use this timeline to talk through how that kind of sequence worked. And Joshua's already mentioned the first one. So back in 2006, we, myself and Oliver, who's my other co-founding partner, entered an open competition for a beach hut. You had to make a little model. We were part 1 year out students at that point. So we'd finished our degrees, but not yet started our master's studies. And it just seemed like a fun thing to do, that we could make a little model of a beach hut and submit it. We did a site visit up there before the submission. And there was kind of enjoyment in that we really sort of got into, I guess. And never ever expected to win it at all, just that it would be a fun process to go through. But we did win. We were one of a cluster, maybe 4 huts that got £20,000 to build something, which to us at that time felt like all the money in the world. You know what I mean? Like, we're 21 years old and suddenly somebody gives you 20 grand to build a thing. So that was super exciting. But the other thing that was kind of fortunate, I guess, about that was that our first client was Lincolnshire County Council. So off the bat, we're already in the public sector. So that was a nice thing. And we built it out, and it was fun. It was cute. There were donkeys. And then you have to kind of scroll quite a long way through various slightly artsy commissions. This was the next sort of substantial thing, I guess, that we worked on, which was looking at arts proposals in the landscape of the Olympic Park in London. So we teamed up with Thomas Klasnick, who still runs the Klasnick Corporation, and an artist called Rita Ikonen, who's an amazing Finnish artist. So this little kind of group of us, again, just for the sort of enjoyment of it, responded to an open call. We actually didn't win that competition that we initially responded to, but Sarah Weir, who at the time was head of arts and culture at the Olympic Delivery Authority, so kind of responsible for the delivery of the Olympic Park and all those buildings, I guess liked what she saw in the submission, and then came back to us with this other kind of little commission to work alongside the landscape architects. So the image here is from the Fantasticology Meadows, and what we were doing there is planting wildflowers, but in a kind of printing process. So they're in the footprints of the former industrial buildings that were on the site in these locations. So you can just see a bunch of kind of canisters in the blue circles there. The idea was to kind of celebrate all of the science and knowledge that sat behind some of the design in the landscape. So for us, that was super exciting. I mean, we were very proud that it was bigger than the orbit, which is that big swirly thing that Anish Kapoor did in the park. But I mean, budget-wise, they were very small, but it was really exciting to be involved in that process and to see that working. But again, you can start to see that there's a kind of public realm thing happening in the portfolio already. And then a few years later, and this is the point where we both kind of were fully employed by We Made That at this point, we won this competition, which was for a natural play space called the Wild Kingdom, which was commissioned actually by the same woman, Sarah Weir, who we'd been involved with in the Olympic Park, the art stuff. And that was really exciting. It was, again, it was about 150,000, I think, so reasonably modest as a budget, but for us, just a lovely thing to kind of get involved with and to be designing. There's various little sort of funny, slightly indulgent bits of bespoke concrete in green. And the other thing that was interesting about this project is we had a separate commission to undertake the sort of engagement program that ran alongside the design of this new play space. And so this idea of reaching out to people and kind of getting communities involved with the process in slightly more imaginative ways than just what do you think of our proposals, because they were children. So we had to kind of do workshops and on-site bug hotel building and various things to kind of invite them into this slightly isolated area for this playground. Was a process that we really enjoyed. So by this point, I guess we're kind of getting into our stride. So up to project number 47. This is Croydon South End. So our first kind of delivery of High Streets project, it was an interesting context. So this was a particular high street to the south of the kind of central Croydon in South London, where there had been significant impact from the 2011 riots. So in fact, the money, it was called the Mayor's Regeneration Fund, I think. It's basically riot money. It went to places that were really affected by those riots. And vacancy on this high street was, I think, about 16% when we started the project. So really quite significantly impacted, and there were businesses that had been affected or relocated because their other buildings had burnt down. A quite kind of visceral impact of that happening. So we worked, and I've got more information about this one, so I won't go too much into it. But at this point, we were collaborating with a landscape practice called Hassel. And in a way, they were kind of broader shoulders, but it meant that we could really focus on things that were, I guess, the lovely bits of the project. I think they're lovely. So I can move on and talk about that in a bit more detail as we go through the presentation. And then this is the last one that I'm going to just mention in this sequence, partly because I've talked about it later in the presentation. But what Walworth wants. So this was an incremental master plan, in a way, an incremental strategy for a particular area of South London called Walworth. And then I guess kind of across that spectrum, there's an evolution of enjoying kind of strategic thinking. How can our design work make changes in the places where we're working? And also an enjoyment of graphic things, and still kind of a scattering of delivery across the portfolio. So just, I mean, in terms of starting, that's how it happened for us. I don't know that I recommend it for everybody, but that was how we did it. So I mentioned that I would talk a bit more about the Croydon South End project, and here it is. So it was quite an extensive length of high street. I think it was about 1.5 kilometres or something from one end to the other, with this high streety bit, which was formally recognised as the borough's restaurant quarter, and everything with this little red pattern on is a restaurant in there. So there was this sort of cluster of restaurant-y things. And then kind of towards the south, it kind of branches off into this smaller road, which felt much more villagey. And we ended up speaking about kind of vibrant and village as these two characters that the design needed to reconcile or sort of support. One of the things that the council had suggested is that as part of this process of kind of high street regeneration, I think they had about £3 million to invest, that we would put some A1 boards, like foam boards, just in the window of an empty shop, because there were loads of those around. And that would be how we'd kind of ask people what they thought about the project. And we thought, well, that sounds rubbish. That doesn't sound like a good thing to do. So what we managed to do is to convince the council with, I think, about £5,000 or something. I mean, it was a relatively modest bit of spend to take on the lease of one of those empty shops and allow us to fit it out. We worked with students from the construction skills course at Croydon College to do this very, very basic fit out of the shop, including this sort of CNC table of the street that we could talk to people around where proposals were coming forward. But because the council had taken on that lease for a whole month, rather than just putting things in a window, and we had all of the space inside, we were able to offer the shop up for just anybody to use it, basically, if they wanted to. So this is the launch of a publication that some students from the Architecture Foundation, who were working with the Architecture Foundation, had put together. So there's this kind of launch event. There was a local arts charity who made bunting in there. There was life drawing, various other things going on. But what was great about it is that all the skepticism that we'd had from traders on the high street and just people that we'd been speaking to about, I give my opinion and nobody ever does anything. Like, why would I bother talking to you, because the council will never do anything? We were doing something. Like, it was immediate proof that we were kind of committed to actually making some change there. And it was sort of enjoyable as well as a process. It allowed us to have some good conversations that I think we wouldn't have had already. It led on to a sort of spin-off commission called the Croydon Meanwhile Use Toolkit. So we were commissioned by the council to help with this online resource for supporting meanwhile uses. The idea was that it didn't need to be always the council were kind of bringing forward temporary uses in all of these vacant shops that Croydon had at that time, and actually has again now for other reasons. But if they put the resources, they put kind of template leases online, suggestions for how to talk to a landlord and convince them that it might be a good idea to have a temporary use in their shop or in a public space that somebody else was in control of. The idea was to basically chivvy along Croydon's enthusiastic communities to bring their own temporary uses into fruition. And so, as I said, this was a sort of resource that had all of those clues about things that you might need to be aware of. It had some quite good stuff, which is we could give the specific name of the person in the planning department that you should speak to if you were concerned about whether your project needed planning consent or not. It didn't need to be general. We could say, call this guy, he'll be able to help, because it was Croydon specific. So that was really useful. And because those things were happening kind of, or in theory, they were happening organically, we had this process through the website where people could submit their projects so that we were able to kind of keep track of things that were going on, which otherwise might have been happening kind of slightly in isolation. So there was this sort of open source aspect to the project. And to support it and promote it, we ran the Croydon Meanwhile Use competition. So we had about £5,000 in prize money that was given out. We asked community members to submit their ideas and then distributed this prize money. But that was really great because it not only kind of garnered some interest, but there were some really interesting things that came out of it. So Alice Crepney, who's here in the checked skirt, runs a charity called Turf Projects, who were one of the groups that had done this bunting making in the shop that we'd put on for a month. They have since gone on with the support of this grant initially, and then kind of obviously onwards funding beyond then, to take on empty shops in, well, first of all, a smaller unit in the back of a shopping centre in central Croydon for Turf Projects to run a gallery and studio space, and have subsequently moved on to run what's called the Croydon Art Store, which is a 3 or 4 store, I think it's 3-storey sort of slice of a shopping centre. So you wouldn't necessarily think of it as one unit, but you know, when shops go over 2 floors in a shopping centre, taken on all of those for this Croydon Art Store, which includes, again, gallery space, studio space, kind of working space for various other organisations. So kind of actually brilliant local charity that probably kind of started or was kicked into that kind of temporary occupation, at least with some help from this project. And then Andrew Dickinson, who's this guy in the check shirt, grows mushrooms on old coffee grounds called Croydon mushrooms, and I think he's still doing that too. So there were various kind of little bits of sort of hooking in and support to local community groups that, again, was kind of really gratifying in that process. And then going back to the actual delivery project, one of the things that we were keen to do was to celebrate the existing heritage. So this was recognised as sort of local equivalent of a conservation area. So there was something about just saying, what is here is great, and look at this ridiculous fretwork on. I mean, just to restore that and paint it. I mean, it was all broken and rotten and missing. To do that, to be able to clean up the brickwork and put some new shop fronts on these shops, was really just saying, this area that you think, or that people were telling us they thought was not that great, there is more to it to that, and it is actually quite charming. So let's not look too quickly. The other thing that I want to just draw attention to is the hoarding on this unit. So we established that it would have cost about £20,000, I think, to bring this unit back into use. And there was a strong feeling from the public engagement that we shouldn't be rewarding these private owners who'd let their property go to rack and ruin and go, okay, well, you get the biggest amount of money of all of them because your shop's in such a poor state. So instead, we came to this compromise where they could be hoarded with this kind of bespoke screen printed hoarding. But what we did was work with a local charity called the Turnaround Centre, who work primarily with excluded children or excluded young people. And rather than kind of handing over the pen and having something that's drawn by teenagers, we worked with an illustrator called Jenny Bowers and a local print studio to involve those young people in physically the act of screen printing the hoardings, so that they could go past and see their work and feel proud of it, learn something through the process. It was all like, it's a slight complication on how you would normally deliver, but not that much different for a huge amount of gain, I think. So that's always been something that we've been kind of looking to do, is see where there's little potential for I guess, kind of added social value in our projects. And I think we worked on 52 shops in the end, so it was quite a complicated process, each of those with different owners and tenants and so on. So yes, quite complicated, but trying to bring some kind of cohesion across the shop units, get units that had been vacant into a lettable state. And then there were various little pockets of public realm, which were again about kind of supporting street life. This pub had kind of horrible hoarding overall. So, I mean, now you can see through, and there's a public space of some quality directly in front of it. And again, that sort of idea of celebrating what you have applied to some shopping parades, which certainly other people hadn't celebrated before. So this is a sort of late 60s, 70s little shopping parade at the southern end of the area, where we put these Festival of Britain patterns on their hoardings and just said, well, actually, this can be lovely. So that's it, all I'm going to say about Croydon. I'm going to move on now, though, to one of our research projects, just for a bit of a change of pace. So this is some work from a project called High Streets for All, which we were commissioned to do by the Mayor of London, which was looking at the social value of London's high streets. We worked with the London School of Economics, or LSE Cities, and kind of a team within the LSE, to kind of get to grips with what does change mean in London, and for London's high streets in particular. We looked at a wide range of evidence for different things, and we then chose case studies to kind of dive into in more detail and do surveys on the ground, because I think it's really difficult to properly understand social value without speaking to people, basically. So that was the lens that we took on it. But we began the process by this kind of big data review of what was going on in London. This is a map that I always think is really fascinating. It is about relative change in diversity. So the blue areas are becoming relatively less diverse, and the warmer colours, the reds and oranges, are becoming relatively more diverse. So immediately you can see there's this kind of whitening, I guess, of the centre of London's high streets, and then increasing relative diversity around the edges. And what we did was look through a number of parameters. We looked at house price change, we looked at this localised demographic change, we looked at a number of new housing units delivered, for example, through this lens, these little shapes of London's high streets, all 602 of them, and chose places that were at the really far end of that spectrum. So in this case, Burnt Oak having a big change in diversity over the period that we were looking at, that 10-year period. Similarly, we looked at Lewisham because it had huge numbers of new flats delivered, and Lower Clapton in Hackney because it had had a massive change in house prices. And I guess the sort of secret question, which we weren't explicitly asking, was what's the effect of gentrification on London's high streets? But there was this sense of kind of extreme amounts of urban change kind of underlying the things that we were interested in through this study. And what we found was, we thought really important and not documented to date, but that high streets were this amazing kind of piece of infrastructure that were driving all kinds of different social value, that you just have to, I mean, in some ways we know this because we're so familiar with them, but just to take a few of these examples, ways into work. So the idea that as your first job, you might go to the high street, or for a Saturday job, you might go to the high street. The idea that you might go and walk down a street to try and find some work rather than go to an individual business. Like the high street is the thing that you're visiting for that purpose. And I certainly did that as a teenager, is really significant. There's kind of visible employment there. We also learned that there are high employment densities within all of these shops. There was something really interesting in terms of conviviality and contact, that people, particularly those who might be at risk of social isolation, would just go to the high street, not really for anything or to talk to anyone, but to be amongst the kind of buzz of the city. And all of that feels quite nostalgic at the moment, but there was this function that was really important, and that there were some things, not just face-to-face contact, but that the catchment, in a way, the demographic catchment of high streets, what we found was that 51% of people that we spoke to during the day in these surveys were not in employment or education, not unemployed as such, like not claimants, but maybe young families, potentially actually literally unemployed, or young people who are slightly outside of the structures of employment that might mean that they were more vulnerable, or people that we might consider kind of needing to look after a little bit in society. And in some ways that makes sense, because if they're not at work during the day, then, I mean, if you're at work during the day, you're not on the high street. So you kind of, not that surprising, but it's kind of, we always think that it's worth remembering that was 51% compared with 27% of London's whole population in this status of not being employed, means that they're this kind of catchment for people that we might want to take better care of. So to be dismissive of high streets is kind of missing some of the things that they're offering to society more broadly. And I'm not going to go through them all, but for us that was really fascinating. And what that has developed into is a more recent piece of work with Gore Scott architects, this high streets and town centres adaptive strategies. So clearly there's big challenges on high streets across the country related to declining kind of retail, or declining physical retail, increase in online shopping, various, I mean, COVID obviously is the more obvious, the more pressing one right now, and happened after this strategy was written. But I think some of the trends that it's picking up on, and the need for high streets to be more flexible, be steered by strategies that are able to look at the evidence and respond locally to those challenges. All of those principles, I think, still stand in this particularly tricky situation that we're in now. So I'd highlighted on one of those previous slides that Burn Oak was one of our case studies for High Streets for All. And we actually, in fact, the timing is that we probably started this strategy before it was our case study. But we worked on this project, which was a town centre strategy for Burn Oak, with a small amount of delivery kind of tagged onto it. So we worked through the kind of pretty thorough appraisal process looking at the town centre. There were definitely challenges related to this big kind of change in diversities. People were certainly talking to us about that, but there were other challenges on the high street. It was incredibly sort of cannibalistic in a way. Like if one shop started selling something that was doing well, 5 other shops would start doing that straight away, and then they'd all be undercutting each other. So there's a very homogenous offer, mostly of kind of fresh fruit and vegetables along the high street, which doesn't sound bad, but is quite not a particularly healthy business environment, amongst other things that we'd identified. And so we put together this strategy which set out a number of actions that the council could be taking, both kind of regeneration and public realm work, but also work that would involve other council departments. The fly tipping guys needed to be called in quite often. There was an issue with crime and antisocial behaviour, as well as some bigger opportunity sites that I think the council have now procured partners for. And the process of developing that strategy, we worked with some graphic designers called Madison Graphic, just to make sure that there was something about quality of offer that Burnt Oak, I mean, it's the other thing to say about it is it has some really challenging issues of deprivation in the communities that live near there. And just a general sense of like, oh, it never gets invested in, people never care about it. So there was a sense from the beginning that every communication about the project had to be of a certain kind of caliber and slightly optimism. And we undertook a number of different events. This is from a photographic exhibition of kind of portraits from the high street, but also had the opportunity for people to kind of feed into the development process. And then I mentioned that we had a small amount of delivery money, so I think there was about 350,000 for some of these small kind of initial projects. We called them hotspots, so those little circles that were on the strategy drawing earlier. It was about kind of little bits of focused intervention that, so this guy, Roy, in the back here, previously had, I mean, you wouldn't even call it a porta cabin. It was less than a porta cabin, tiny little shack. And so really, really difficult for him to trade from. No power. So the fridge with his drinks in the back actually wasn't plugged into anything. Big problems with leaking, very difficult for him to trade from, but also not a particularly positive arrival for people coming out of the tube station. So whilst the immediate communities of Burnt Oak High Street have big issues with deprivation, there are some incredibly rich people that come through this area, either through the tube station or just kind of in the vicinity. So the idea that it might be possible to kind of capture some of that spend and for him to be able to trade properly was a really important one. There are some funny jokes. It's clad in burnt oak. But there was a totally kind of sensible contextual reason for that, which is that the conservation areas nearby all have this kind of black timber cladding. So it wasn't just a joke, it was also a joke. And so we delivered little things like this new kiosk. And some other things. So one of the comments that we had back again and again from people was that there was nothing to do, nothing going on, no support. And it actually just wasn't really true. It just wasn't, you couldn't tell that it was there. So there was a lot going on in this library. There's actually a little kind of cluster. If I just pop back, here is library, a church, a community hall, a GP surgery, and then the park. So this amazing kind of civic cluster at the top end of the high street. But really hard to actually see what's going on in there, or for anybody to kind of appreciate that. So one of the things that we did was revisit the forecourt of the library and introduce this notice board, which number one is just making really clear what's actually going on in the library, but also could had kind of digital elements that could be updated easily to kind of give this rolling picture of what was going on inside. And so that kind of holistically was the whole set of proposals. So new public realm, refurbishment to this building, which actually was kind of lovely already, although a very weird sort of 90s mosaic swirly wall in front, like all kinds of weird decisions. So it was about kind of opening that up, inviting people into the library, as well as celebrating some of the activity that was already happening. And then it was a high street project, and we did have some money that went towards kind of shopfront improvements there, which are fine. I think what's interesting about them is that the impact locally, people really comment on them. They really appreciate that, like, oh yeah, you've sort of spent that on me. It's almost how it feels, not just for the shop owners, but for the customers who are going there, and helps them to appreciate and in fact, this is all a conservation area anyway, helps them to appreciate their area, or to kind of look again, I guess, with fresh eyes. And then this is the final sort of set of projects, and maybe there's a bit of a theme, which is that we like to keep working in a place and sort of unpacking the next bit, or having a strategy and then delivering a bit of it and then delivering the next bit, or doing some research and then doing a strategy off the back of it, that sort of rolling program of sustained engagement with a place. And this is one of those examples. So this is the What Walworth Wants strategy, which includes, I don't know if any of you really know that area, but it's a kind of big area of regeneration in London. And this Walworth part that we were looking at sort of sits between two really massive estate regeneration programs. So sort of in between, left out kind of a place. And so the idea of this strategy was to put together a series of relatively small bits of investment and projects that were collectively kind of developed and could then be picked off partly by the council, but could also be delivered by other partners locally, so that every little step that anybody was able to take would all be building towards a kind of bigger coherent picture, rather than people randomly doing their own little projects without any kind of bigger vision. And East Street Market is one of the key features of that area. So I mentioned that, I mean, a really important part of the process was making sure that we were talking to people to develop the ideas that then ended up in the document. And we did. And here's a photo from that. This is just like a specific strategy that we use quite often, which is a set of like a big stack of other ideas from other places, just because we find that particularly if we're talking to people who are not so fluent in regeneration or haven't had that much experience, spend their lives doing other things, which is obviously fine, that the feedback that you can get from them is, oh, it should be greener, or it should be cleaner. And there's so much more that can be done that we find it really useful to bring in specific examples, and just as prompts, even if they all just get tossed away, like, don't like that isn't relevant to us. It helps us to talk in more detail about what might be possible for a place. And so the document ended up looking like this. This was also working with Madison Graphic. The idea was that it was something that you really wanted to take off the shelf and to use. And I think the sort of folio does that, or you could take out little sections to say, oh, this is the project that I'm going to deliver next. And so we worked through various kind of locations where there's a set of sort of, I mean, it's basically a shopping list. It's not really design, it's a strategy, but there's something quite compelling, I guess, about, or I hope there is, about communicating in this way, or sort of accessible in saying what could be possible and what could be achieved. There's some less attractive stuff in there, but still really important. So this idea that other people might get involved in delivery means that we have to tell them more about how they could get funding for their projects. And so this section just lists out, these are all the different people that you might approach for grants. This is grants that are currently available, a sense of the scale of those grants. So it's really just trying to share those resources more broadly. And then we delivered some little things. So this was some bits along East Street Market itself. So the kind of shop fronts and signage, little bits of furniture that could be used more flexibly as part of the market. And then as part of that whole package, this was one of the ideas, so the East Street Exchange. So this is the existing East Street Library, or was the existing East Street Library, in the kind of ground floor of this post-war kind of mixed-use block. I mentioned that there's this big estate regeneration happening either side of the area, and on one of those, the intention is to build a new library there. So the idea is that this library basically gets relocated there. And so the local authority position on that had been, well, then we don't need to really do anything with this one. We'll just not invest in it for now. That can get run into the ground, and then we'll have the new shiny one soon anyway. Our position was, number one, that's not really a great way to run your library. But also, wouldn't it be great if actually what we did was make that long library kind of stronger, better than ever, so that when it moves, you're moving with a captive audience who really values it, but also that you're left with an asset that people understand can be used in different ways. So we had an idea not only that we could refurbish the existing library, but with a small extension, we could make it possible for it to accommodate events, private hire, an amount of co-working space. So it was this kind of just looking differently, looking through the other end of the telescope, I guess, at the problem. And so that was part of this bigger strategy. And we were then commissioned to take that forward. So it sort of evolved a little bit. There's still this, I mean, up to this point here is existing, and then this tiny little extension here with refurbishment throughout. And we built it. Joshua said that maybe there's a building in there somewhere, so I thought I'd better finish with one. But I mean, you can see this is the existing block, and then just peeking up here, we thought it was important to kind of, again, I guess, ask people to look again at something which they'd perhaps overlooked previously. And that's the Street Exchange. So this little extension kind of peeking over onto the Old Kent Road. So this is a really, really busy road at this point. Just something to pique your curiosity in the day and at night, but to have this potentially privately hireable and separate from the rest of the library was really important. And again, I think there's a certain commitment to quality of delivery that, although the budget has been modest, we've taken decisions that mean that actually the fact that there's this really chunky sill for us is important, that there's something, the aluminium is quite an expensive one. I don't know, I'm in a group of architects, so I think you know what I mean, but this isn't a shonky shed that we're trying to do. We're trying to do something of quality, albeit just a small piece because the budget is small. And then here this is the extension at the end, and this was the refurbished bit of the library, but because we were moving some of the space or kind of giving that extra space, there is now this possibility for people to actually work from the library in a more flexible way, whereas previously they were kind of in amongst the borrowing shelves. And that is that bit, the new room itself, which has been used really flexibly, so it can be used for meetings or private parties, for yoga, all sorts of activities. It's, like I say, it's only pretty small, but I think what it does has more impact than its footprint might lead you to believe. So I think that is my last slide, and I think that is about 45 minutes, which is what I was aiming for. So maybe we can just go into questions, and I will stop sharing for now, and if we need to come back to anything, I can do that.
Thank you, Holly. That was really inspiring. Thank you. I think echo a couple of the comments that quite a few of those left me with a smile on my face, and just seeing the direct impact of the project and the work on the end user, which is sometimes can be lost depending on how you're working and who you're working with. So we do have a few questions. I'll start off with one I have. I guess with the in-house research team that you have, do you have any kind of, or have you been able to create any self-generated projects that where you've seen a problem and kind of gone into it from that end rather than being someone coming to you?
I mean, it's been a kind of ongoing question, and there are, I guess we'd call them initiatives rather than projects. There are things that we have self-initiated for sure. I don't know that they're particularly tied to the research team. So at the moment we've got I don't know what to call it, a program called Reset Go, which is trying to diversify architecture practices. So we're part of a group. I'm really conscious that I'm only talking about London, so I'm just going to apologise for that and carry on. Sorry. We do have projects outside, and actually we now have a Manchester office with nobody in it. So we are part of this group called the London Practice Forum, which is a group of 21 practices of like I don't know, it's not very scientific how it's put together, but it's similar kind of age, kind of emerging-ish practices, certain scale. There's a sort of commonality there. And we've been able to secure some funding for supporting paid work placements, mentoring and workshops that are trying to particularly invite underrepresented groups, so women and people from BAME backgrounds into architecture through that. And that was something that we've come up with. So we do that, but it's more it's not a project that ever goes on to pay any bills, and we're kind of doing it consciously because we think it has impact.
Of course.
I think there's a way of talking about research in architecture practices that implies that you should be doing it to generate work, and I think or like test types of concrete or something, and that's definitely not what we're doing.
No.
And the truth is that there's a lot of work for that team, and more often than not we're responding to commission briefs.
Okay. I guess it was looking at I was thinking more a case of kind of research from one may have spit out information that has inspired kind of another project that's perhaps not directly related. I guess following on from that, do you do much kind of post occupancy evaluation with your projects? Is that even possible with kind of the high street kind of stuff?
I think like everybody, we'd love to do loads more. And there is never the budget all the time to go back and do that. I mean, I mentioned the Croydon South End project at the beginning of that. The vacancy was about 16%. I think it was down to 6 or 7% at the end of the project. I'm sure it's higher again now. So like, I don't know how much we take credit for that, but there was an impact or there was a change in that picture. And so we are really keen on that. One of the things that and we do quite a lot of work with economists, and I didn't really mention any of that side of, I guess the LSE came up, but we do quite a lot of work with economists, and actually more and more so at the moment, because we're sort of going, I guess, further upstream, so into decision making about where does money get allocated. So doing strategies that secure the funding to then do a delivery project. And that is a process that basically involves economists doing clever things with benefit cost ratios and
spreadsheet.
Loads of spreadsheets. And so that in that context, the idea of impact and kind of making sure that you say at the beginning what you're trying to achieve, and then you do a thing and you see if you achieved it or not. That seems more and more important. So I can imagine that we would be doing more of that.
Okay, cool. I'll hand over to Sarah. I've seen questions come in. So
there are a few questions coming in. Can I be a little bit selfish and ask you a question myself before I get on to other questions? Thank you. I really loved your presentation. I thought it was really inspirational. I think I love that you're bridging that communication gap, or at least that perceived communication gap between the public and the local authorities. And I guess what I'm wondering is, have you found that when given a chance, people do engage with public projects, they are actually interested? Or have you found that it's dependent on other parameters, I guess, and you might need to push engagement sometimes?
I mean, we've always said that, I mean, we did a project ages and ages ago. In fact, probably one of the first high street projects, which was a newspaper it's called High Street 2012. So it was supposed to be the route for the London Marathon. It never was in the end. And we'd made this newspaper and handed it out on the street. And I think if we handed it out and said, here's a thing about kind of urban change, or something about urbanism or something about architecture, and be like, nah, not for me. But if you say this is about the local area and change in the local area, everybody wanted to take that. Like, we all live in these places, we're frustrated by them, we're in love with them. I think you can have a really good conversation with anybody about where they live or places that they know and the things that are good and bad about them. And so I've never found that it's difficult to do that. I think the challenge is people can feel that they're not really genuinely being listened to, and that's fair often. And so we just have to kind of take that at face value, and that people are under lots of pressure. They've got loads of other things going on. Yeah. And so if they don't have time to engage or capacity to engage, then fair enough. And particularly in these high street environments, there's a lot of businesses that are just trying to get by. Mm-hmm. They don't need to also come to your business association meeting, even though you think it's a really good idea. And so I think it's about being sensitive to people's situations. And some of the kind of tactics that we've used, so that kind of screen printing workshop thing, if we just invite those young people to come and look at some drawings and say, do you think this is the right thing to do or not that interested. Yeah. But we're kind of having a bit of added value or something a bit more generous. So we're doing a few programs like that at the moment, where we've been making podcasts. We're going to start a film club on an estate around here soon. Other things that are more us giving than taking. And for us, that's a way of broadening participation.
Oh, that's brilliant. Right, let's move on to other questions that have been coming in. Bijal, sorry if I don't pronounce your name correctly, is asking that, is there a worry that, I guess, with some of these areas that are getting much needed improvement, is there a worry that they would get gentrified, and are there strategies that can prevent this from happening? And he said, thank you, Holly, your projects really make me smile.
That's very nice to hear. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a worry about that. The position that I always, or that I think we come from as a practice, is that the answer can't be that we don't do anything. Like, if somewhere is lacking or not good enough for the people that live there or the people that use it, then doing nothing isn't the right answer either. So if we're doing something, then there should be a positive impact, and that sometimes has an impact on values, is the truth of it. And I don't know that you can totally prevent that, but I think we're always really keen to make sure that that the investments in the projects are for the benefit of those people wherever they can be. So we're not going in and trying to make money, and our clients aren't going in and trying to make money. So already that is sort of neutral. And I think when that's your angle on things, then your motivation is different. But I can't say that, I mean, we did a lot of work in an area called Black Horse Lane in London, which I'm sure people would point out and say has been gentrified. I don't know that we're wholly responsible for that either. Like, we're only a small part in all of the things that are going on and all the millions that get spent in these kind of places. But for us, it's about looking at genuinely, what do people who are already there value in this place, and how can we kind of support and amplify that? And that feels like the right way of going about it. But I'm sure that it happens. The other thing is, and I think I slightly saw a question from Greg. Hi, Greg. About this as well. Maybe I haven't read it. But moderating gentrification as part of high street improvement work. I think that high streets are so good at doing that themselves. And that was one of the things that we found through the High Streets for All work, was that even in So Lower Clapton was like the gentrification example, really, where house prices have gone absolutely ridiculously astronomical over that 10-year period. And when we were we were kind of expecting a lot of anti-coffee shop chat in the conversations, but what we heard from people was actually, you know, like, yeah, there's a bunch of hipsters and I don't go into those places that they go to, but I can still go to all those other ones that I do like, and it's cleaner and it's safer, and some of these things are good. And high streets, because they're owned by so many different people, it's so impossible to get everybody pointing in the same direction. Like, you can't come in and just do a big change because they really resist it, and you'll never get everybody on the same page. And a lot of people kind of think that's a terrible thing. Oh God, high streets are so complicated. So there's so much different ownership, you can't make them do anything. And I just choose to look at it and think that it's beautiful and difficult, and that's great. And so I think high streets are quite good at it. And where we see that, like, again, apologies for all the London examples, but it's the ones that kind of spring to mind. But I live in Brixton, and there's a set of railway arches that had lots of shops and kind of traders in, that were all owned by one owner, and all changed in one go, like all started up, all the businesses kicked out. And that's when people really object. It's like there's this big violent shift that people feel like, oh, I'm being pushed away from a place that I know. And high streets kind of don't let you do that because they're too complicated. So I think that's my answer, is that we have to keep high streets in this really difficult ownership, and it'll be a preventative for us all. And where somebody's trying to buy up a whole parade, then that's when I feel like, I don't know if that's going to be good.
Yeah. There are a few questions coming about the practice itself. So Aisha is asking, during the period between 2006 and 2010 or 2011, how did you survive and how did you make it through? It seems like a long period to wait for a project or initiative to go through. Were you pitching in for projects or waiting, etc.?
Well, we were students for a large part of that. So I mentioned that was kind of in between our part one and part two. So we were still doing projects kind of evenings and weekends throughout studies, trying to sort of put them into the portfolios and saying, look, here, I've also been doing this thing. So there was a lot of that. And actually Oliver finished his master's, which isn't in architecture. He did design interactions at the Royal College of Art. Finished his master's and straight away went into just doing this full time. I wanted to be an architect for my sins, and so I went into practice. I worked at Cottrell and Vermeulen for 2.5 years to get my part 3, and still evenings and weekends. So that, like, we were never kind of, I don't know, never sitting waiting for projects. We were sort of waiting until it built up enough momentum that it could sustain us through various different hustles. But yeah,
you had a clear interest in public projects right from the start. Like you in that period of time, you didn't take any other or you didn't do any other projects that were like an individual building.
We did a loft extension for our friends who were adopting some kids. And so we thought, like, yeah, okay, we can do that. But no, we didn't, because if you're doing it evenings and weekends, it has to be stuff that you really want to do.
Yeah.
And it was just that, like, it wasn't a bigger, like, oh, if we do this, then we're going to build up a portfolio and then we'll have a turnover of X in 2020. Like, it was never that at that point. It was, doing it because we were passionate about it, and you'd have to be, because we were doing it late at night and over the weekend, and that was fine. And that was, like, we were happy to do it because we were enjoying it. And I mean, it got much more intentional. There are business plans now that, you know, it's, and there have been for a long time, actually. I mean, we did that, I mean, probably 2010 we started doing that. So we were taking it seriously, and don't want to, like, because we were doing it, we loved it. We didn't care if we had any food in the fridge. Like, it wasn't like that. We've always, and actually Oliver in particular is an entrepreneur, really. Like, I'm just lucky that I grabbed hold of him to take care of that stuff. But the business side of things has always been important. But certainly those early years were driven by, well, it's going to have to be something that we really like to do, because it's going to be difficult to do it.
No, absolutely. So we've got other questions. Leah is saying, hi, great presentation. How did you find setting up a practice so early in your career? And you kind of answered this about working for other practices before qualifying. So was it kind of scary, I guess, in a way to get started very young?
I don't know. I think it was because it was such a kind of slow on ramp. I think it was much less scary. Like I can imagine if I'd got my part 3 and then you have a certain salary and like certain, you get used to living in a certain way, that would be a much scarier time to do it, I think. Like I'm always in awe of people that like that big leap. We took tiny little steps.
Yeah.
We never really a big leap. And we were also slightly pushed into it, I guess, because we won that competition right from the beginning. It's like, oh, we have to set up a bank account. Oh, I have to start doing my tax return. Like you had to just do it. So
yeah.
So I think it was fine, and we sort of just learned as we went. We did work for other I worked at Cochrane and Vermeulen, and I mentioned Oliver worked at AOC in his part 1 year out, and I worked at a practice called Hudson Architects doing fancy houses for rich people. It was lovely practice and really enjoyed it, and learned an awful lot about kind of staying curious and not being afraid to ask silly questions and taking on responsibility and all kinds of things. But I don't like choosing taps for rich people, and I get told off for saying that's a dismissive way of describing people who do totally beautiful and lovely domestic projects and have really great portfolios for it, but I just wouldn't get me out of bed.
Yeah, I guess like just having that strong ethos like is, it's just motivational, I guess, every day in the work that you do.
I mean that's what we're in the game for.
Paul is asking, how do you market yourselves and how has that changed over the years since conception?
We've always had this only public stuff angle. So we've always kind of spoken about it in that way, and because of the work that we do, marketing is a particular thing because everything's tendered, so everything goes through tender portals. We're not really picking up things from kind of there's an amount of direct appointment when people kind of know the portfolio and the practice, but everything's very structured. So the marketing that we've been doing has been, first of all, there was like a little bunch of people. There was like Assemble and us and Studio Weave. It felt like there was a kind of gang at a certain point. And there was promotion around being just like kids doing weird stuff, which I think I hope has kind of worn off by now. And now the marketing that we do is trying to be, I mean, we have a PR guy who helps us, and it's kind of more conventional about just project announcements, trying to keep people up to date with what we're doing, but also around public speaking on areas that we have certain expertise in. So I meant like high streets, industry in the city, all these kinds of things. It has really helped for us to have the time to evolve certain amount of knowledge and expertise in certain areas. And I think the marketing, particularly in terms of outreach to new people and new places, has been broadly off that basis. So it's definitely more targeted now. There's comm strategies and stuff that kind of guide it. But we are trying to get to quite a restricted market in a way because it's public sector clients. So there's certain awards that we go for and certain that we think like not really for us, doesn't really get our guys. Some quite boring magazines. Quite happy when we're in the boring ones. There's some important stuff in there. So yeah, not just all the kind of slick stuff targeted at architects, I guess is what I'm saying.
Oh, that's very interesting. Aisha is asking, commenting, lovely presentation. Is it possible to get in touch with you to learn more about the initiative of enabling women and BAME communities to join practice? I'm asking out of personal interest and also on behalf of initiatives here in Nottingham, Women in Architecture Group, for example.
Yeah, for sure. So we have a studio email address that you can get in touch. It's just resetgo with a hyphen between reset and go at wemadethat.co.uk. And there's people that will be very happy to answer those questions. you can also get the website is resetgo.xyz.
Right, I think we answered almost all questions. Josh, do we have time to take another question?
Yeah, we have time. As long as Holly's happy to answer them.
Yeah, I'm fine. There's maybe some in the Q&A box.
Sure.
It's difficult, isn't it, when things are split between the chat and the...
Yeah, they are.
There's one at the end that is kind of asking about your own inspirations in literature, such as Lynch's work that you use, or has it got to the stage where you've developed your own kind of methods, and you I guess you don't feel you need to do inspirational research on your own, I guess. But within architecture, I suppose we're all doing that, or kind of anyway, just as we go through day to day.
Yeah, I think actually, I don't know, I think the video is still on the website. We have a little clip that a guy that we know did a video of us ages ago. We look so young. But in that, I say something about inspiration, which is maybe a bit dismissive, and I don't mean it to be dismissive of the question, but basically, I don't really believe in inspiration. I don't think you get like this magic strike or like, oh wow, bing, idea. Like we work really hard and turn over loads of stones to see if there's something interesting under there. And sometimes we find something interesting, and then that's like loads of times there's nothing there, and then we find something that's interesting. So I think it's normally focused around the individual project, and trying to kind of figure it out. So I mentioned this film club, and we've really just started really little engagement commission on an estate just down the road from here. And in the kind of putting together of the tender documents for that, we found that in the, I guess, 60s and 70s, it was called the Brandon Estate Cine Club, and all these amazing old cine films of like Sports Day and kind of baby beauty contests on this estate that now doesn't exist. But we are trying to think of ways to engage young people, and like, how fantastic is that to find that thing already exists? We can show them that footage. Look, this is what it used to be like. You guys love filming each other all the time on your phones, so let's do some film stuff. I don't know that that's inspiration, but it's kind of research, and I think that in a way is why the research team exists, is this sort of, if we look hard enough and in interesting ways, we can join some dots that will work for us. And I think that probably drives things more than we read the stuff as well, like we're not ignorant, but that's probably more where it comes from.
Yeah, so it's always more about doing the hard legwork kind of research, and the more you do that, and the more likely you're going to come across something that's going to spark the thread of design, or whatever it may be. Big believer in that right here, although the team hate me for it sometimes, because like, oh my god, we're doing another appraisal, do we have to do all these maps? Like, yes, do the maps, I love the maps. Like, I don't want to do the maps. I like maps too,
but we do the maps.
Okay, so I think there's a couple more. I guess Tyne Beck, apologies if I've mispronounced that, is asking if you would like to share your thoughts on art on the high street. What do you think works? I guess in my head, I'm interpreting it that as the kind of the sculptures that appear on the corners, street corners, or at junctions.
Yeah, it does come up, and I think I'm trying to think. I mean, there's something about not the literal shop windows of the shops, but the fact that the high street is a shop window for people walking through it. There's some like really strong potential for communication, I think, that exists on high streets that can be really interesting. And we've done a few projects that have involved flank walls and, you know, decoration of things that can be really visible and seen by the community. I don't know that you can make a rule about what works and what doesn't work, but I do know that the one project that we did that explicitly had like help us do this art commission as part of the brief, we went through quite a comprehensive process, and every time we do something like this, like an art commission within our bigger commission where we're trying to find an artist to work with, it's a tricky process that has to be handled. But like there's lots of stuff about selection and whether people are local and that kind of plays into it. So our pain in a way is all about that process. And one of the things that we learned, and that I am really pleased that we did on the Black Horse Lane project, which was one that had this flank wall art commission involved, was the winner was a local artist that completely goes against all of our taste. Like it shouldn't be for us. And I think there can be a sense of I think it is possible to overlook how tailored architects' aesthetic preferences can be,
Yes.
and how exclusionary that can be.
Yeah. It's
and yeah, choose something because it's going to be tasteful and it's going to look nice in the photos of your project. Like, well,
Yeah,
this is not our project, this is their high street.
yeah.
And so the choice of this artist who did those kind of spangly sequin things that hang on the wall and do was totally the right thing to do. And I really don't like it, but that's okay.
Yeah.
It was the right thing. It was for that area. It was this artist who's pretty significant. He actually subsequently died, which was really a shame. A shame is the wrong way to describe it. Like really sad that this artist who was so locally important passed away, and how great to have this thing on the wall that he that he was responsible for, even if it might not be like completely to our slightly snobby tastes.
Yeah, of course. I think it can be tricky when, or I think a lot of the examples where it's not been successful is because someone has imposed their opinion or taste on an area and it looks completely out of place. I think it's always going to stitch in a lot more effectively if it's something that's from that area, whether it's a high street or whether it's a neighborhood or a whole city, I guess.
Yeah, but I don't think that means that it has to be from a local artist. So I'm sort of going against myself, but there's something about it being driven through local decisions that seems important.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's everything. There's one final one, I guess, from Robert Evans, asking again, highlighting how the impact of COVID and the fact that it's inevitably, like, potentially at least going to result in less high street shops, or at least in the short term anyway. I guess just certainly outside of London, that's going to have a more significant impact. I can't see it not really. I guess, do you have any thoughts on that, and how has that impacted your most immediate work?
Yeah, I think it's really important to look at the truth of what's going on the ground when we think about these things, because it's too easy to generalize or kind of have a picture of what's going on with high streets that may not necessarily be true. So first of all, the evidence tells us in the latest kind of ONS evidence that typically high streets have about 33% retail as what they're made up of. In London, that's a bit less, so maybe 10 to 20%, but that is so much less than what people think of. And the studies that have taken place show that maybe 2/3 of trips to high streets are for reasons other than shopping. So this idea that shopping is the be all and end all of what high streets have to offer is something that we have to challenge. And then even things like your comment, like, oh, well, London's not so bad. Actually, the centre of London is fucked, isn't it? Like, who's going to travel to this really, really busy, thronging place to go to a shop that you can totally do that shopping online? So there's a sort of we have to take each individual high street and look at it on its own merits. And for some places, there will be opportunities because people are shopping more locally. People don't have to live in the big metropolis anymore. And so an offer that is more tailored to its local communities is really important. But I think high streets will continue. I mean, they've always been this place of accommodating change. They changed when we started shopping in supermarkets instead of individual butchers, bakers, grocers. They changed when we started doing out-of-town retail centres, which then everybody realised was a bad idea, and then we stopped. And they'll be changing again. And I think there's lots of other stuff that happens in cities that can totally happen on a high street, whether it's healthcare, education, community uses, cultural uses, workspace, the opportunity to work near to home, not having to go all the way into central office business district, but not be in your spare room. All of these kind of things I think are opportunities, and high streets have always done that shimmy, and I think they'll continue to do that. But there will be fewer shops, and like that's okay. There are fewer banks as well. We've all got over it. I mean, mostly people have got over it. There are some people still a bit sore about there being no banks on high streets anymore, but they have historically been a very adaptable sort of structure, and I'm sure that can continue to happen. We just need to have the sort of flexibility within the bureaucracy that surrounds them to allow that, without letting them get flooded with residential, which is at the moment the biggest risk.
Yeah.
All of the current kind of planning changes are completely misguided, basically.
Yeah.
You're going to put really, really, really horrible places to live on high streets, and then the high streets are going to be horrible as well. Bad idea.
Okay, well, I think that's everything. Sarah, anything further from yourself?
No, that was great. Thank you very much, Holly. That was really food for thought and very inspirational.
Yes, thank you very
everyone.
much. Thank you for
lovely questions too. Cheers.
I think it just leaves me to remind everyone that we've got some events, one next week on how to meet your RIBA 2030 climate change targets. That's on the 23rd of February. And then on the 2nd of March, we have an introduction to renewables with David Reed. And then, as I said at the beginning, we have our third practice profile office Sean on the 9th of March. So by all means, go and check our website and our Eventbrite pages for registering for those. Yeah, once again, thank you, Holly, much appreciated. And I hope everyone enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again soon at the next event. Thank you.
Thanks.